A 49-year-old former Marine medevac pilot sat in seat 23C, clutching a cheap plastic compass on her keychain when the captain's voice cracked over the speakers for the last time. She was just another passenger on Atlantic Wings, Flight 417, New York to London, 287 souls on a Boeing 777, pushing through the North Atlantic night at 35,000 feet. But 32 minutes later, both pilots were unresponsive in their seats. The autopilot was fighting a cascading electrical fault, and the only person on that plane who understood what the instruments were actually saying was the woman in row 23 who hadn't touched a yoke in 8 years. Before we go any further, drop a comment below. What state are you watching from? I read every single one. And if this is the kind of story you came here for, subscribe. There are more coming. Let's get back to Rachel Harlan. Rachel looked exactly like what everyone expected her to be. A tired mom type traveling with her 12-year-old nephew Tyler. Denim jacket, sensible sneakers, hair pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail. The kind of passenger flight attendants smiled at politely and then forgot. "Everything okay back here, ma'am?" the young purser asked, leaning over their row during the dinner service. "Your son seems a little restless." "Nephew," Rachel corrected gently, her voice carrying that faint Texas drawl she'd never quite lost. "We're fine, thank you." Tyler was glued to his tablet, headphones on, completely unaware. Rachel smiled at him, then turned to the window. Outside, the wing lights cut through thin cirrus. Inside, she rubbed the small compass keychain between her thumb and forefinger. It had been her father's. Cheap thing from his first solo flight in the 70s. She carried it everywhere, even though she told herself it was silly. In her head, she was calculating descent rates and fuel burn the way other people counted ceiling tiles. Old habit. 8 years since she'd last flown anything bigger than a Cessna, and even that had been touch and go after the crash in Helmand that took her flight status and half her hearing in one ear. The captain's voice came on earlier for the standard announcements. Confident, routine. Rachel had nodded along, but something in the back of her mind had flickered. The way the crew had moved a little slower during boarding, the smell of the meals coming out of the galley. She pushed the thought down. Not your airplane, Ray. Not anymore. She settled deeper into her seat, eyes closing for what she hoped would be most of the 7-hour flight. On the surface, everything was calm. Underneath, that old unease was already stirring. The knowledge had come to her in pieces, the way real skills always do. Her flight instructor back in the Marines, Master Gunnery Sergeant Ruiz, hadn't been gentle. He lost his own son in a training accident the year before Rachel showed up. A kid who reminded him of her, he said once. That's why he rode her harder than anyone else in the squadron. They'd been in the simulator at Pendleton at 0301 freezing morning, rain hammering the roof. Ruiz had failed every primary system on her, one by one. "When the hell am I ever going to need to hand fly a heavy through icing with half the instruments dark?" she'd snapped, sweat stinging her eyes. Ruiz had looked at her for a long beat. "The sky doesn't care about your rank or your doubts, kid. It only cares if you're willing to listen." That line had stuck. He'd made her listen that night, really listen, to the way the aircraft talked when everything was falling apart. The subtle vibration changes, the way the control yoke felt heavier in certain configurations, the sound of the engines shifting under load. He taught her things no commercial manual would ever cover, because Marines flew where the rules sometimes had to bend to bring people home. She remembered the weight of the helmet, the taste of recycled air, the way her hands used to shake after a medevac run when the adrenaline finally crashed. And she remembered promising herself she'd never need any of it again. A surprising thing most people don't know, modern airliners like the 777 are incredibly stable on autopilot, but when that autopilot starts losing inputs from faulty sensors, it doesn't always tell you nicely. It just starts lying in small, deadly ways. Rachel knew that from Ruiz. Most passengers never would. The memory faded. Rachel opened her eyes. The cabin lights were still soft. Tyler was asleep against her shoulder. Everything normal, until the seatbelt sign pinged on. Up in the cockpit, Captain Michael Reynolds and First Officer Lena Patel were finishing their meal service break. Two experienced pilots on a routine oceanic crossing. The North Atlantic was behaving itself. Light turbulence, clear enough skies for now. The flight management system showed them tracking perfectly along their assigned NAT track. In the cabin, a businessman in 12A was quietly stressing about a presentation in London. A young couple on their honeymoon in row 15 were whispering and laughing. An elderly woman near Rachel was knitting what looked like a tiny sweater for a grandchild she'd meet for the first time tomorrow. Rachel noticed the flight attendant pause near the cockpit door a little longer than usual. She dismissed it. Planes have rhythms. Small hiccups happen. Then the first chime sounded. Not the usual one. Something sharper. The aircraft gave the faintest shudder. Nothing dramatic. Just enough for Rachel's body to remember what that particular vibration meant. She sat up straighter. Not everything that looks fine is fine. It started small, a slight drift in the ride. Then the cabin crew moving quickly toward the front, muffled voices. The plane began a shallow, uncommanded descent. Rachel unbuckled quietly. She moved up the aisle, Tyler's worried eyes following her. When she reached the forward galley, the purser was pale. "Ma'am, you need to return to your seat." "I can help," Rachel said, voice low. "I used to fly heavies." The purser hesitated. Then the cockpit door opened briefly and she saw it. Both pilots slumped, unresponsive. Food poisoning, maybe, or something worse. The first officer was barely conscious, trying to speak. Standard procedures were failing fast. The autopilot was disengaging intermittently. Electrical buses were dropping offline. Rachel stood there feeling the full weight of both choices. Stay invisible and let procedures play out, maybe too slowly. Or step forward and risk everything, including her nephew watching. Stay with me here, because what happens in the next few minutes is the part nobody talks about. And once you hear it, you won't be able to forget it. I want you to think about what you would have done in her position. Hold on to that thought. Rachel stepped into the cockpit. The remaining crew member stared at her. "Ma'am, you can't be in here." She pointed to the standby instruments. "Your attitude indicator is feeding bad data. Look at the slip skid. You're already in a shallow bank the autopilot isn't correcting." She reached over, carefully, and adjusted one switch. The plane responded immediately, in a way only someone who knew the systems would recognize. The purser's eyes widened. The first officer, fading in and out, managed a weak nod. They let her sit in the right seat. Rachel's hands found the yoke. The anchoring compass keychain hung from her bag on the jump seat. It caught the red cockpit lighting and looked almost alive. Outside, the first signs of heavier weather were building. She passed a flight attendant helping a terrified passenger and saw the woman's face, the same fear she'd seen in the back of a Black Hawk once. That was the real stakes, not the airplane. The people. She took the aircraft. The physical reality hit immediately. The 777 felt like trying to steer a city block with a broomstick after years away. Her palms were slick. The yoke vibrated with the electrical gremlins fighting her inputs. Ruiz's voice was suddenly in her head. Listen to her. She assessed. Partial hydraulic assist still online but degrading. One engine running slightly rough. Weather ahead. Icing conditions building on their track. They had maybe 40 minutes before the situation became unrecoverable. Atlantic Center. This is Atlantic Wings 417 declaring emergency. We have dual pilot incapacitation. Passenger with heavy time assuming control. The controller's voice was steady but tight. They began feeding her vectors, but Rachel knew they were too far out for perfect guidance. She would have to do this the old way. Step by step she stabilized, trimmed for best glide profile, started a slow descent to thicker air where the controls would feel more responsive. She talked the remaining crew through basic tasks, resetting circuit breakers in sequence, monitoring fuel. Then the crisis inside the crisis hit. The left generator dropped offline completely. Warning lights flooded the panel. The aircraft yawed hard.
For 10 terrifying seconds, Rachel fought the controls manually while the first officer mumbled incoherent warnings. Her arms burned. The compass keychain swung wildly. She remembered something Ruiz had drilled into her, a workaround using the ram air turbine and crossbleed, not in any commercial checklist, something from a combat scenario where you made do with half a plane. It worked, barely. The power came back online with a surge that rattled the entire fuselage. In the middle of it all, The first officer reached over and squeezed her forearm for just a second. No words, just the smallest human gesture in the middle of mechanical hell. Rachel felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them away. The final approach into diversion at Shannon was the slowest torture. Every call-out stretched. The prophetic line came back to her as the runway lights appeared through broken cloud. The sky doesn't care about your rank or your doubts. It only cares if you're willing to listen. She listened. She flared. The wheels kissed Irish tarmac with a thud that was far from perfect but alive. Thrust reversers roared. They rolled out safely. Silence filled the cockpit for a long moment before the cheers from the cabin filtered forward. Rachel's hands wouldn't stop shaking as she taxied clear. Her legs felt like water when she finally stood. For one absurd second, she wanted to laugh and cry at the same time. The first officer, now getting medical attention, looked at her with something like awe and shame mixed together. He managed a weak thumbs up. Passengers later described the moment they realized what had happened, the quiet prayers turning to stunned gratitude. One man said he thought about his own daughter the entire time. Ground crew and emergency services swarmed with professional calm, but their eyes said everything. A supervisor pulled her aside later and simply said, "Thank you for bringing them home." Tyler found her in the chaos and hugged her so hard it hurt. She held him and thought about her father, about Ruiz, about every flight she'd ever doubted she'd survive. The compass keychain was still warm in her pocket. It felt heavier now. Weeks later, back in Texas, Rachel sat with Tyler in a quiet park. Ordinary life had returned, but it felt different. People recognized her sometimes. She hated it and understood it at the same time. She visited Ruiz at his small airfield outside San Antonio. Same old hangar smell, same battered simulator. He didn't say much at first, just handed her a cold soda like old times. "You did good, kid." Rachel turned the compass in her hands. "I keep wondering if I was ready for that moment, or if the moment made me ready." Ruiz looked out at the runway for a long time. "Doesn't matter. You listened. That's all the sky ever asked." If this story moved you, I'd have more where this came from. Subscribe so you don't miss what's next, and leave a comment below telling me which moment in this story stayed with you. I genuinely want to know. Some people are called to the sky. Others are reminded in the darkest hour above the ocean that they never really left it.